So in this webinar, we're having a look at how JavaScript tools can make you 10 times faster at development. But what does that even mean? And why do you want to be able to do this? It's actually a really interesting thing. 10 times faster is not a small amount. Being 10 times faster means that there are 10 of you, for example, doing the same kind of stuff that it would normally take one of you to do. And to get that kind of result, well, you're going to have to use something really awesome. And we're going to get into that very shortly. But it's also something that I've learned in my last 10 years of development too, that trying to do everything yourself is sometimes not practical. And it's how I actually grew from a junior developer to a senior developer, learning these lessons and using some of these tools that we'll be looking at. And these will make you better. So let's actually jump into having a look at today's webinar. So to start off with, we're going to start with a simple introduction. This will cover more or less who I am and what I do, and a little bit of background so that you understand that I'm talking about an example here of real world situations, things that I've learned, things that I've implemented, and things that you can implement yourself too. We're going to start off as well with some JavaScript tools and history, so you get to understand where these tools came from and why they were created in the first place, and how they basically speed up development. Now, when we talk about speed up development, there's obviously two parts to that. You can be a faster developer by creating things faster, or you can be a faster developer by spending less time to achieve different things. This means you can either save your company money or make your company more money. So there's two benefits, obviously. We're going to have a look at a really powerful tool here, a real case study for an example that does this well, which will be the Froala WYSIWYG HTML editor. We'll also have a look at a couple of other ones like Fusion Charts as well as Sancha, and we'll finish up with some questions and answers. So let's just jump straight into it. So for those people who have never heard of me before, my name is Adrian and I'm from Australia. I do development and design, and I've been doing so for the last 10 years or more. Over that time, I've learned a lot. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've also had a lot of solutions that I've figured out too. And all of this has helped me now grow my skill set and even start my own company where I'm doing more work than ever. It also means that I've started a YouTube channel where now I teach a lot of these things, and hopefully all of this experience can be passed along, at least a small portion of it, for this specific thing that we'll be looking at today for JavaScript development and how to do so faster. For a long time in my growth, when I was a developer, I tried to do everything myself. And while it was fun, it was enjoyable, and it was time consuming, I learned that sometimes that's not the best way, because anything that takes you a lot of time will also take you a lot of money, because time is money. So this is where we'll be looking at development and how to speed that up in this webinar, and having a look at how we can do that with different tools. We're going to start off by having a look at also why it's worth you watching this webinar. Because while I've told you that you're going to save time, let's actually have a look at exactly what this webinar will provide for you. The first thing is that we're going to try and save you time. Time is probably one of the most important factors that a developer provides to the table when they're working. We're not here in retail where we might be selling products like clothing. We're not limited by the clothing, we're limited to amount of time we have per day. This means that usually we only have 7 to maybe 10 hours per day to complete different tasks. And the tasks can be simple or they can be difficult, but if we run out of that time, that's it for the day. So having an effective way to manage the time and provide solutions is probably one of the most important things a developer can do. On top of that, when we're going out in the real world and we're doing projects for different clients, we're building web apps, there's going to be a question of how much time is involved to complete this task, to create this solution. And that can be a very difficult thing to sometimes summarize, especially for developers where we have to create all sorts of things. But if we have proven solutions to do this, we can definitely give those estimates and we can deliver those solutions in much less time. The second part to this is also effort. So everything that we do does actually require mental effort. When you're trying to solve some algebra or some math, you will eventually get tired. And it's exactly the same with programming. If you sit there staring at code and try to figure out different problems and create different features and solutions, you're going to run out of energy or start making mistakes or lots of other stuff. And this is actual effort that a developer only has so much of. It's why sometimes developers, when they go home, they don't have any more energy to do anything and we might just clock off for the day. So making sure that we can save that for other tasks that we can do is just as important as the time itself. So effort is another thing that you'll be saving for when we'll be looking at some of these proven ways to do faster development very shortly. Another thing is that as a byproduct of some of the things that we're going to be learning in this webinar, you're also going to be better at learning JavaScript and utilizing it to your best advantage, because these lessons that we're going to apply for this webinar for actually implementing this tool, for example, this WYSIWYG editor, is going to carry across to other features you might need to develop. Or for example, if you're trying to create a graph or something else like a user table, then you might think and go, actually, I don't have to create this from scratch. I can maybe have a think of doing it a different way. And this is actually the thing that I want you guys to really take away from this, that a lot of the problems sometimes that we don't have to face on our own, but there are proven solutions out there for. So let's move on to the next item here. And that is the features and functionality that is provided when you're using a tool rather than trying to build something yourself. And when I mean this, I mean that, like, if, for example, you're building a JavaScript tool to do graphics, maybe a graph for example, and you're trying to make a hover effect as a feature so that maybe it gives you some statistics when you hover over one of the bar graphs or something like that, that takes time to code. And that one feature might just be a single feature you've added. Whereas if you're using a tool that's made by an entire team, this tool could have lots of features that you would never be able to do yourself. And on top of that, there are continuously going to be new features added as well. And this is really cool. It means that you don't have to spend so much time maintaining existing features or building out new features. And this even brings me to my next point, and that is the automatic updates that come along with tools. Technology changes all the time. You can probably see this when you have a look at the Node version we're currently on, or even if you have a look Create React App or React in general, we're constantly improving and iterating over different types of coding methodologies and security. And all of this means that whenever you're building a tool, you're going to have to continuously update it to keep it compliant in terms of security and how different code is functioning. And having an existing tool that's developed by a team will also give you those benefits of being up to date as well. So this is why it's so important to have a look at what options are available rather than trying to build it yourself, where you'll have to do all that maintenance yourself as well. Nothing speaks more volumes than real-world examples, like examples where companies are actually out in the wild using tools to speed up development rather than building everything themselves. We can look right now in the marketplace by things like Drupal, for example, or WordPress, and have a look at how their CMS works. And if we have a look closely, we can see they are using tools like WYSIWYG editors to do posts. And if you have your own CRM, or if you are building your own web app, you should be doing that. If you have a look at some of the largest organizations around the world, things like, for example, Samsung or IBM or Amazon or even Adobe, these companies are using these tools, and they're making these tools essentially allowing them to speed up their development lifecycle without building everything from scratch and maintaining it in a way that it doesn't cost a burden on them to do so. So let's actually have a look at some of the history of why we started using JavaScript tools and how they came about from a background of JavaScript and where we're currently at, as well as where we're going into the future. And this will give you a bit of better perspective on why it's so important that these tools are being used. You probably all know that JavaScript has been around for a very long time. It originally came about with a few basic functions that didn't do much, maybe a pop-up to give you an alert, but a lot of the functionality that you wanted, you'd normally have to code entirely yourself. And this meant that it was actually quite tedious to build tools around it. It actually meant that a lot of time had to be invested, and this also meant that a lot of people just didn't want to do that. So what ended up happening was there's this language, this sort of pseudo language that came out called jQuery. Now, jQuery is probably one of the first examples of a tool within, for example, JavaScript that would speed up development. This tool basically took what JavaScript currently did and made it simple. And this is the bare essentials of what tools do. They actually make your life simpler by completing the functionality that you want in a quick and simple fashion. Now let's take a look at some of the things that jQuery did by a tool that accessed the DOM and created functionality in JavaScript that otherwise would have been a little bit more difficult to do. So for example, it could look up a ID or a class name for a div, and it could apply different styles, for example, CSS styles, to that div. Now this might have been maybe 5, 10, 20 lines of code in plain JavaScript, whereas with jQuery, you could do it in a single line of code. And this obviously means that you're saving yourself 10 lines of code, you're 10 times faster. And you've simplified it. You don't have to figure out how to do it. You don't have to Google it. The syntax is simple and it just does the job. As this became more popular, more and more people started creating jQuery tools. And you probably would see bundles and bundles of them back in the day, where you would just add them to jQuery and they would create a calendar, or they would create some sort of functionality or animation. It just went haywire to the point where websites were importing maybe 100 different jQuery tools. Now, as you can imagine, this might unrealistically become a burden for the user because you're downloading so much data. Nothing really was set in a way of having actual people develop and maintain these projects. It became a little bit difficult, and a lot of people started disliking jQuery as a general purpose tool to import other tools as well. And this is about the same time that React came out, and other tools started being a little bit more independent, saying they're no longer going to use jQuery, they're going to just be plain old JavaScript, and they're going to still complete the functionality you want as a tool, but be much lighter weight. The end result is that jQuery taught a lot of people that you can build entire ecosystems and tools around JavaScript that can be maintained by teams and can be independent but up to date. And this is sort of where you can leverage other people's work to build upon your own. And it's why JavaScript is one of the most powerful tools out there, with a great community behind there. And this is where we're going to lead into having a look at this WYSIWYG editor. This is a powerful tool, and it's one that I've used in a lot of my projects, because almost every single type of project that you do obviously sometimes needs content that needs to be updated by a user. Most users don't know code, and they need a way to be able to modify and edit content themselves, whether it's blog posts or content on a website or something entirely different. So we're going to have a look at WYSIWYG editors, and we're going to have a look at specifically the Froala WYSIWYG editor as a tool, comparing it to maybe, for example, doing it natively yourself and some of the benefits around that. Let's start by having a look at what is a WYSIWYG editor, which is a pretty interesting question. A WYSIWYG editor stands for what you see is what you get. And in plain English, that's pretty accurate to what its functionality is as a tool. And while its name might not be something like content editor or visual editor or something like that, it is essentially a JavaScript tool that allows you to edit on-screen content that accurately depicts and reflects the appearance of the final product of that content. This means that for a user that's trying to update maybe their own blog posts, for example, and they want to add in some images, maybe a table, we normally as developers are working in code, and we understand what that might look like on the back end. But a WYSIWYG editor basically allows someone to visually represent that information accurately to what it would already look like on the page, while also editing that information in real time, with that appearance being modified in the backend code as well. Plainly put, users can modify their content and see those changes. And this is also the power that this tool brings into play. The fact that users can do this means that it can be useful for a lot of different types of content, whether you're uploading images or doing blog posts or writing, for example, even page content or doing something in a learning management system. Basically, a WYSIWYG editor provides most of the tools that you'll be using, whether it's adding emojis or doing paragraphs or adding tables. All those tools are in there ready to go for a person that doesn't know how to code. And this is where we start into having a look at how a WYSIWYG editor basically can add 10x your development. Basically, whether you're working on a small project as a developer or an entirely large project, I would say 99% of the time, you're going to need some sort of dynamic content on your page. And while in the past, the features and functionality that we put to create dynamic content might be a single input or a text area, they might not serve their purpose. So we might need 5 text areas or different uploads or an image section or something like that. And you're doing a lot of this time and effort yourself. Maintaining a project of that size, maintaining all the inputs and trying to create all of that functionality can become entirely tedious to a developer who has to basically manually create all the functionality of, say, maybe a table that repeats itself from a collection of data from an SQL table. And maybe then you have to update that in the future. It becomes slowly a nightmare. And a WYSIWYG editor means that while in the past developers had to then do all the updates they had themselves, when, for example, maybe a change request came in to update a website, the developer had to be called, a support contract would have to be done, changes would have to be done, testing would have to be done. You can now put this directly on the user's side. The developer can entirely take their hands off the project. We could create a WYSIWYG editor where people can edit their own content and visually see what that content looks like and approve those changes without a developer being involved at all. And this completely changes the game in development, because all of that time that we would normally spend on manually making those changes now is taken away and it's streamlined. Let's actually have a look at how manual editing of JavaScript used to happen in divs in the past and how a WYSIWYG editor basically changes this. In the past, we might have a text area or a div. And while these basically give us the ability to write in content, it's not very much content. It's basically plain text if you're using a text area. Or for example, if you're using something else like maybe input, then it might be just plain text as well, or an image upload to a certain size. You don't really get very much control over that. Even the dimensions or resizing it, there's not much around that you can do. Whereas, for example, a WYSIWYG editor, you can define exactly what that looks like, whether it's the width or the height. You can define exactly what kind of features you have, whether you're only allowing people to bold items or if you're allowing people to list items, what colors you allowed, whether you allow hyperlinking. There's so many different versatilities to it. It's quite interesting. And this basically makes it a lot easier for users to use, because when you're able to add your own hyperlinks, which you would never really be able to do in a text area, you can do so much more. You can have edits, you can have undos, you can have help and assistance. You could even, for example, add things like quotations and list items in there. So these are just basic examples of what a pre-made tool like a WYSIWYG editor can provide. And I know that some people might be thinking, well, it's overkill. What about if I write the functionality myself? Well, that's not always the best idea. And this is where that development improvement comes along, where maybe a manager comes along and says, hey, look, I've got this div that currently is being edited by users, and they're just putting in some plain text in here, but sometimes we need them to be able to bold some text. Can you write a function or a feature in our product here to bold some text? Well, normally you could do this. You could write up a function and this is what it would look like. You could change the style, do a lookup, create a function, and change the styling to be bold for a piece of text. And while this might work and we could link it to a button, it's not a practical way because this could easily blow out of proportion. Let's have a look at this next example now, where we're trying to take this to the next level. We're adding in underlines and italics. We're adding in headers for maybe header 1, 2, and 3. And immediately you can see that the code starts to increase. And this increase is exponential. It gets more complicated. You get more functions that are happening here. And later in the future, even revising and refactoring this could become a nightmare. It becomes time consuming. And it's not always the best way. So while we started off with a simple thing of just wanting to bold some text, maybe the solution isn't to try and create that functionality yourself. We can have a look at creating some functionality through a WYSIWYG editor, where we could write out maybe 1 or 2 lines of code and we can immediately get all of that working for us. But not just that. We have advanced features too, like hyperlinking, like colors, like much more. So that way, we're going to now have a look at just how many different functionalities we get for this Froala advanced WYSIWYG editor. And let's have a look at this, because this is actually quite interesting, and it's what changed me from trying to code these things myself to using pre-made tools. Firstly, the theme. Anytime you're building any project, you're going to want to theme it in your company's colors. Now, normally you could do this yourself, and this could be also a little bit of a time-consuming task, especially if you're trying to create these functions out yourself. But with Froala, for example, for the WYSIWYG editor, you simply select what your theming is. You can select your primary color, your secondary color, and the entire application reflects that, whether it's black or white or gray or blue. It's easy to do, and you can get it up and running immediately. But not only that, like you can customize exactly what buttons you want there. You want different functionality or width. Like the entire thing is customizable to a level and a degree that just isn't usually done if you're doing it alone. On top of that, you can introduce your own third-party packages. Now, I personally love Font Awesome. Some of my favorite icons exist on the Font Awesome package, and personally, if I was going to use icons for bolding and italics and stuff like that, I would be using the font family, the Font Awesome packages here. So having a integration of your own code, for example, to do this might actually be quite complicated. But with a WYSIWYG editor that is managed by a team and the team actually builds it to have third-party compliance for packages, like for example, Font Awesome or CodeMirror, you can immediately utilize those features into your project. And this makes life a lot easier. On top of that, it has other features too. So for example, something that React makes really cool is that you can immediately have live changes. But take this a step further, and we have a WYSIWYG editor here that not only provides you the visual representation of what the end product looks like, you can also see the code as well if you wanted to copy that out. So code preview or live code preview is something that I personally would like to do because I basically want to see everything that I'm doing. There's other features that you can apply as well, such as for example, and this one always gives me a nightmare to integrate myself, drag and drop. It seems like an easy feature, but imagine trying to write out a JavaScript function that does accurate drag and drop for you within a content editor that also, does the hierarchy and ranging of different content. It would be a nightmare. And yet, for example, using a tool that's pre-made immediately brings in something that you could easily just say, yes, I want drag and drop functionality. There it is immediately. You can select whether it does the drag and drop for buttons or, for example, images or text or links. You can really refine and customize it to work exactly how you want. And I think that's really cool. And this is where I want you guys all to take a step back and really consider if there's a project you're currently working on or you might be working on in the future that could use a WYSIWYG editor or a JavaScript tool to speed up your development. Because by adding one, you might be saving yourself a lot of time and effort. And there's so many different components to this, whether you want to do the visual editing yourself for pages, or whether if you want to pass that on to the end client or user to do themselves. Just have a think whether a WYSIWYG editor could really benefit them and how it could be implemented with just a few lines of code to achieve things like putting straight into a database to update pages, because I think that'd be really useful. Now, I know one of your questions might be, well, I'm not just using plain JavaScript. Maybe I'm using React or Angular or something entirely different. Maybe I'm just using plain old WordPress. Well, the thing is that normally if you're using your own JavaScript tool and you're trying to write something yourself, you might link it only to use that one library, such as, for example, React. But when you've got a team behind a project like this one here by Froala, you're going to have the benefit of it being basically capable to take on any library. So whether you're using Django or Ember or Craft CMS, it's basically ready to go for any one of these platforms. And this is one of the really cool things that you won't have to really worry about because it's just going to be ready for you to use. Now, I hope you like that overview of WYSIWYG as a tool in JavaScript, but there's more tools out there that you might want to check out, especially for your next project, whether you're building an admin dashboard or some statistics. Here's a really good one as well called Fusion Charts. It's actually a JavaScript tool to create really cool graphics that you might not have realized you can build. And there are over 100 different charts, 200 different types of maps. There's so many customizable options here for Fusion Charts as a JavaScript tool that you'd be surprised. It's actually loved by more than 800,000 developers across the globe, working with things like JavaScript and React and Vue and Angular. And really, it actually has quite a few different charts that you might want to check out now. So let's actually have a look at some of them. We've got a mix between, for example, this customer satisfaction score, as well as bar graphs and pie graphs and statistical plotting on a graph as well. And realistically, I know that there are other libraries out there and tools like D3 where you could try and map this yourself, but sometimes those things are very difficult to do. And this is where the benefits of using a pre-made tool like Fusion Charts comes into play, because I know that if I'm trying to build something out like this, I could spend easily an entire week trying to figure out how to do it. Whereas with this tool here, I could simply just plug in the data and it'll just work straight away. So that's really cool. Another example is Sancha. And Sancha is actually a tool for doing tables using JavaScript with grids and stuff like that, where you can plug in a huge amount of data, whether it's CSV or TSV or HTML or PDFs even, Excel documents. You basically have the ability to create these kinds of tables with scrolling that goes infinity. You can have pagination, rendering, different styles and options, and you get this ability to even widgetize it into small components of your websites with over 140 different types of UI components for building apps, basically. And I know that this might not seem like something you might use in a general website, but if you're building web apps, if you're working with companies, and you're working with large amounts of data, this is the kind of stuff you want, because if you try to build this using just a regular HTML table, and you try to build it out on a website, well, that website might not load very well, because I know just how much data some organizations have, and trying to manage and display that data in a practical way can be very difficult. So this is a really cool tool that you guys might want to check out as well. And this brings me to about the end of this part of the webinar, where we're looking at basically JavaScript tools and how they come into play to significantly increase your development time by simply not having to build them from the ground up, but by using one that's already out there in the ecosystem, built by a real team that is managed and updated and basically there for you to make your life easier.
Thank you for the presentation, Adrian. I think we are just about out of the time for today's webinar. I would like to remind everyone today's webinar was recorded and you will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording shortly. Once again, thank you for attending today's webinar. We look forward to you joining us next time.